Here are helpful hints to do lab exercise 7. This is cartilage, bone, and blood, which are considered to be part of the connective tissue system. And you need to be able to name the 3 types of cartilage and give the location and function of each type. Be able to name the chondrocytes in the lacuna and what fibers are visible in each of the 3 types of cartilage. And then you're supposed to be able to recognize bone and list its functions. And then you're supposed to be able to look at a microscope slide of bone and name all the parts on the microscope slide. And then you have to tell the parts of an osteon. So let's do that part, and then we'll get into the blood and the skin. One thing that cartilage and bone have in common is they lay down a matrix outside of the cells. And the problem with that is the matrix that they lay down is very, very dense. And so it's going to be hard to get food and air in and get waste out. It's kind of like you painting yourself into the corner of a room. So what the cells are going to have to do is leave an area around them, and this area is called a lacuna or a little lake. So in this picture you see the lacuna and the cell living in it, and then all the stuff that's stained purple around it in this particular instance is hyaline cartilage. So there's some collagen fibers in there for strength, but hyaline cartilage is a thinner, almost translucent connective tissue. It's tough, it's flexible, and you're going to find it in your nose, in your voice box, which is called a larynx, in your trachea, and between your ribs, and covering the ends of your long bones. So when we get down to the bones, you'll actually see that there's a tough, almost like a membrane laying over the end of the bone. And this is to allow tendons and ligaments to attach. So you need to have something. They don't attach directly to the calcium of the bone. They connect to that layer of tissue laying over the bone. The second type of cartilage is elastic cartilage. Again, you're going to have lacuna. So you have these little lakes, and you have the cells living in the little lakes, the lacuna. And these chondrocytes are laying down elastic fibers. So these little black lines here radiating out are the elastic fibers. So chondrocytes live in lacunas, and they can lay down hyaline, they can lay down collagen, they can lay down elastic cartilage, depending on where you are and what kind of strength and flexibility that you need. So you're going to find elastic cartilage in your earlobe, and you're going to find it in your epiglottis. And you're going to find out a little bit later on that your epiglottis is connected to your vocal cords, and you definitely want that to be able to move because you need your vocal cords to vibrate in order to talk or sing or whistle or whatever you do with your vocal cords. So the fibers that you can see in this particular picture are elastic fibers, but there are also collagen fibers in all of the different types of cartilage. It's just predominantly this one's going to have elastic. The third type of cartilage is fibrocartilage, and again you have lacuna, and in this case they're laying down mostly just collagen. So here's a lacuna, and there's the cell, the chondrocyte, that lives inside of the cell. Cyte, the word C-Y-T-E means cell. And all of this outer matrix is mostly just collagen. Collagen in this case is stained blue, but in actual fact it is colorless. We're going to find fibrocartilage in places like the disc in between the vertebra, so the intervertebral disc, the pubic symphysis. So if you look at the 2 halves of your hip bone, they're joined in the front, in the anterior, with a thing that kind of looks like the disc that's found in between the vertebra. But this is to hold the two halves of the pubic bone together. And it doesn't give very much. When a woman gives birth to a baby, it can give slightly, but mostly it does not give. It's also found in the meniscus of the knee. The cells that lived in the lacuna of the cartilage are called chondrocytes, and the cells that live in the lacuna of bone are called osteocytes. So compact bone is the bone that's on the outside of the bones. If you get inside of the bones, you're going to find some spongy or cancellous tissue, which is going to be much more porous. But the outside of all of the bones, it has a very hard layer. And when you slice through these hard layers and look at it under the microscope, you're going to see certain features. In this particular picture, in this microscope slide, you see this hole in the middle, and that's known as the Haversian canal or the central canal. So it's going to allow blood vessels and things to go through there. And then radiating out from it looks like tree rings. So here's a tree ring, here's a tree ring, here's a tree ring. And these are known as lamella. So these rings are known as lamella. And there's all of these little things right there, your lacuna with your osteocytes in them. Now, for nutrients to come from the central canal or the Haversian canal and get all the way out through the lamella and get all the way out to these osteocytes, you're going to have some way of getting there. So if you look, what looks like cracks are actually little canals, and they call them canaliculi or little canals, and the nutrients can get up there and nourish the osteocyte, and then waste can come back down and be carried away through the Haversian canal. So this whole unit, the series of tree ring looking things, the lamella with the central canal, which is the Haversian canal, and all of its associated lacuna with osteocytes, is known as an osteon. An osteon. So these are the 4 pieces that you need to know about an osteon. Here's a picture that I found on the internet, and it shows it a little bit more blown up. You can see the Haversian canal right there, and there are the canaliculi extending to each of the lacuna, to the osteocytes that live in each of the lacuna. So this is just a little bit bigger picture, and this whole thing is considered an osteon. And you can see the lamella a little bit better, the tree ring looking things, you can see a little bit better in this picture. Now you know that your bones support you, but what you may not know is it is also a place where you can store minerals, and you have an almost limitless supply of calcium and phosphorus in your bones. So if you need a little calcium and you're not drinking milk, or you're not eating cheese or eating meat where you're getting calcium, then you're going to start dissolving your bones, and the calcium will be released into the bloodstream. So one of the things that's really important, especially for pregnant women to know, is when you're carrying that baby, your baby has to have calcium to form its structure. And if you don't give it to it, if you don't take prenatal vitamins, you don't eat well, you don't drink milk, or take in calcium, it literally will dissolve your bones. So a lot of women are surprised to find when they're pregnant that their teeth fall out. So we learned in the last chapter about gomphoses, and that's the pocket that your tooth sits down in your jaw. And if you dissolve enough of your bone away, then the gomphosis is no longer there to hold the tooth in place, and your teeth literally just fall out because there's nothing to hold them up anymore. So make sure that you get enough calcium. And if you ever feel your teeth being loose, stop and think, what am I eating? Am I not getting enough calcium? And you can take a supplement, or you can just start drinking milk or eating yogurt. Another type of tissue is your blood. And if you look at this particular picture, you're going to see red blood cells. And if you look, it almost looks like you can see through it. And that's because what the red blood cells do, as they mature, they get so full of hemoglobin that they literally push the nucleus out. So they start out with a nucleus, but then they push it out. And at that point in time, that red blood cell can only live a few months, because you can't live without a nucleus in your cell. So they're going to function for a while, and then they're going to die and fall apart, and we're going to recycle the cell and the hemoglobin and the iron and make new red blood cells. So they don't have a nucleus. They're bowed in the middle, kind of like a breath saver from Lifesaver. And then these things that do have a nucleus are the white blood cells. And we're going to learn in a little while that there's 5 different kinds of white blood cells. And you're going to find them elevated if you have worms. You're going to find them elevated if you have COVID. So we know by looking at which kind of white blood cells that you have elevated what's going on in your body. So it's going to be an interesting thing. So what can you do with your blood? Well, you can protect yourself with the white blood cells, and you can carry oxygen and carbon dioxide using your red blood cells and the plasma. And then if you look, there's something called a megakaryocyte, and we don't have any in this picture, but they're huge compared to the white blood cells and the red blood cells. They're really, really large. And when they're mature, it almost like they shatter. They come apart, and each of the pieces becomes platelets. So if you look, here's a little piece of a platelet right there. Here's a platelet. There's a platelet right there. So those, what looks like little purplish specks here and there, are platelets. And they're involved in allowing your blood to clot. The overall term for a white blood cell is a leukocyte. So there's the word leuko, means white. So white cells. And then we're gonna learn the names of the different types of white blood cells later on, not in this lab. The integumentary system includes your skin, your hairs, your fingernails, and there are 3 layers or main groupings of tissues. And the outer one, the one that's on top of the dermis, is known as the epidermis because it is on top of the dermis. And then in the middle is the dermis, and then underneath it is the hypodermis, and that's where you stick a hypodermic needle. So it goes under the skin and drops off medicine. So that one's pretty easy to remember, the hypodermis. The other way that you can really remember the hypodermis is it's basically a layer of fat. And you think, well, that's not a good thing, but it is, because it partially insulates you, but it also smooths out your features. So when you get old and you dissolve away the fat that's underneath your skin wrinkles up. So the hypodermis is part of what makes you beautiful. The epidermis is stratified squamous epithelium. And it is stratified, means in layers. Squamous means squished flat. So there's usually 4 or 5 layers of that. The outer epidermis is dead cells, and you're constantly sloughing them off at about 1 million an hour. And then as you come down, you have 4 other layers. There's an error in the book. There's a missing layer right here. You have the stratum basal, which is the bottom layer, the stratum spinosa, which is this spiny looking layer, and then you have the stratum lucidum, and it's spelled Lucidum, and then those are the 4 layers that you have. Here's a slide that I found for you on the internet. You can go and look for yourself, and it kind of shows you what you're looking at. So the basal layer is a layer of cuboidal cells, and it is in contact with the basement membrane that underlies your skin. And we're going to find that that basement membrane is kind of important for scarring. When you have a number of unfamiliar things to memorize, sometimes it helps to make a mnemonic or a memory device that'll help you remember. So the first one that I ever remember learning was HOMES, homes, are the 5 Great Lakes. So you might not be able to remember the 5 Great Lakes, but if somebody tells you that the mnemonic is homes, HOMES, you're like, oh, okay, now I can name the 5 Great Lakes. And if you can't remember the layers of the rainbow in order, then you learn Roy G. Biv. And that will tell you that the red is the first, and then orange and yellow, and so on. So there's memory devices, and one of the fun memory devices to remember the 5 layers of the skin is, before signing, get legal counsel. Before signing, get legal counsel. So anyway, I thought that was funny. And then going down into the dermis, you're getting into the dense, irregular connective tissue. So that was actually a test question that you guys had asking, what is it and where is it? And like in the palm of the hand, places where you need the skin to be able to stretch in different directions, you're going to have the irregular connective tissue instead of linear, where you're only stretching in one direction. So you have the top papillary layer, and it's got the word papilla is nipple shaped. So you and I would call these little nipple shaped things sticking up, we would call those our fingerprints. So they're going to be sticking up in irregular patterns that make up our fingerprints. And then you have a thick reticular layer, which would be the majority of your dermis, and that's where you're going to find your hair follicles, your sebaceous glands, which are going to secrete oil, your erector pili muscles, your sweat glands, and your Meissner's corpuscles and your Pacinian corpuscles. So the Meissner's corpuscles are closer to the surface of the dermis, to the top of the dermis, and they're a sensory nerve ending, and the Pacinian corpuscle is one that's deeper down, and we're going to find it kind of looks to me almost like you've sliced an onion. It has those rings like a sliced onion would have. So if it's deep down and looks like a sliced onion, you got your Pacinian corpuscle. The erector pili muscle is my second favorite muscle in the whole body, and it is attached to the outer covering of the hair follicle. And whenever that little teeny tiny muscle contracts, it causes your hair to stand straight up on end. So you're very familiar with seeing them in cats and dogs. If they get angry or frightened, then their hair stands up on end. And so each hair has a little muscle attached to it. Now, you don't have as much fur as an animal does, so when your erector pili contracts, you can actually see it. And you and I call it goosebumps. So that's what a goosebump is. It is where you have made your hair stand up trying to trap a layer of air, warm air around you. So you usually get goosebumps if you're cold, but you can also get them if you're scared, just like a cat or a dog. So that's kind of interesting. You're going to find your sebaceous glands are also attached to the hair follicle because they're going to be making oil, and you want to lubricate your hairs. You want oil on your hairs so that they're not all dry and have split ends. So a lot of people get the sebaceous gland and the sweat gland mixed up, but the sweat glands are not attached to the hair follicles. And they're also much more coiled than the sebaceous glands are. So that's a couple of clues that'll help you differentiate between sebaceous, which are your oil glands, and your sweat glands. All right. To try and get a handle on what you're looking at when you're looking at the model, don't forget you have the epidermis, and then you have the dermis, and then you have the hypodermis. So the hypodermis is pretty easy because that's where your fats are. And we already said the dermis is where the hair follicles and things like that are. And then the epidermis is way up here. So there's your epidermis right there. And a lot of kids tease other children by going, oh, your epidermis is showing. Well, of course it is, because it's the outer layer of your skin. There, once you see the hair shaft, you can see the sebaceous glands that are part of it to put oil on the hair. And then there's your erector pili muscle right there coming off of it. And see, the sweat gland is coiled and it is not attached to the hair. So that should make that a little bit easier. Your papillary layer, over here you can see it a little bit better in this picture. And again, your fingerprints. This is going to be your fingerprints. Here's your Pacinian corpuscle, and it's deep. It's right above the hypodermis. So it's going to be way down here. This picture is a three-dimensional representation of the skin, a cut through of the skin. And this one is as if you had sliced it and put it on a microscope slide. So instead of seeing the whole sweat gland sticking out like you're seeing it here, you're seeing where they've sliced through it. So in your mind, you have to connect these into these coils over here. And here's your hair follicle. And the hair grows out from the bottom of the hair follicle, and there's the hair coming up, and then erupting through the skin. When you look over here, all you see is just part of a cut through of the hair. So it's really hard when you have a slice to figure out what you're looking at, what you're actually seeing. In this particular cut, we can see the Meissner's corpuscle, and this one happens to be up in a papilla, one of those nipple-shaped areas right there. And remember, the Pacinian are going to be way down here just before you get down into the fat of the hypodermis, and they're going to look like a sliced onion. There's your erector pili attached to a hair follicle. Here's another hair follicle and another set of sebaceous glands to secrete oil. And then there's your sweat gland that's been sliced. Kind of funny. So hopefully by now when you see that, you go, oh, that's the sweat gland. But it's actually a coiled structure in there. You're really going to have to look closely at this microscope slide to figure out what's going on in this particular picture. So each of these things that is round like this, and if you look carefully, you'll see that these are actually cuboidal epithelial cells. They're cuboidal cells, and these make up the sweat glands. So all of these that are hollow are the sweat glands. And this happens to be a bald person, so they don't actually have full hairs like you and I have. They're going to have a little bit of a follicle there, and they're going to maybe have a little wispy fine hair there. So this is the hair follicle of a bald person right there. So that's a little confusing. If you look up here where they've cut it away, that's part of the sebaceous glands. So if you follow this hair follicle up, here goes the hair follicle up, and then there's a sebaceous gland. But because you cut through and made a slice, you don't see the whole follicle and shaft connected to the sebaceous gland. So that's a little confusing there. This is a slice of scalp from someone who did have hair, and so you're able to see a little bit better. There's the hair follicle, and there's the hair coming up the shaft, and here's the erector pili. So it's starting over here, and if you see, they've sliced it away, and then you see another piece of it right there, and then they've sliced it away so you don't see where it actually connects here. So you kind of have to fill that in your mind. There's the muscle, the erector pili. Pili means skin, or excuse me, means hair, and so if you do a depilatory, you are removing your hair. So pili means hair, and erector pili will pull it erect. It's spelled erector, but it causes the hair to stand up on end. It's kind of easy to see the hypodermis there because it's fat. Down here, the sebaceous glands are going to be a little bit of a challenge. But here they are. So again, there's the hair coming down the hair follicle, and you see this, which is associated with the hair follicle, which you can't see because you've cut the rest of the hair follicle away. But there's your sebaceous gland, and it kind of looks filled in as opposed to the sweat glands. The sweat glands are usually, because the liquid is clear, it looks like they're empty. This part is going to be fairly easy for you to remember. So the skeletal system has 5 basic bone shapes. You've got your long bones, so that would of course be your humerus, your femur, your tibia, fibula, ulna, and radius. And then your short bones are roughly cube-shaped, so that would be those bones in your wrist and your ankles. So your carpals and your tarsals would be short bones. And one of the short bones that's specifically shaped like a sesame seed is your kneecap. So your patella is an example of a sesamoid or sesame seed shaped bone. Then you have your flat bones, and that would be your breastbone is flat. If you look at your scapula, your shoulder blades, those are also flat. Your ribs are flat, and of course your skull is flat. Although it's curved, the bone itself is flat. Now, a lot of people put the hip bones in with the flat bones, but in this lab manual, we are putting the hip bones in with the irregular bones. So the vertebra, as you remember looking at the cervical vertebra and the thoracic vertebra and so on, those are definitely irregularly shaped. They are not anything like the femur. You never can confuse them with a wrist bone or anything like that. So they're very oddly shaped. The hyoid bone also fits in the irregular bone category. It's important to know the different areas of a long bone, what makes up a long bone, especially when you're looking at the epiphyseal plates. So you're going to have a kind of a cavity in there where you're going to have your bone marrow. So they call that your medullary or marrow cavity. And then you're having spongy bone at both ends. And this is to make your bones lighter. So you need your bones to be strong enough to support you. But if they were solid, like the compact bone out here where we're looking at osteons, your bones would be so heavy you would have trouble walking. So you have a lot of spongy bone to provide support, but not be quite so heavy. And you can't see it on this particular bone right here, but there is an epiphyseal plate. There is some connective tissue growing right there and right here, and it is able to divide and then fill in with calcium and turn to bone. So this is the site where your long bones grow longer. So you go from being less than 2 feet tall when you're a little bitty kid to being 5 or 6 feet tall. And in order to do that, you have to have the epiphyseal or the growth plate, it's sometimes called the growth plate, growing. And why this is important, if you break your long bones, if you break your humerus, if you break your femur, if it goes through the epiphyseal plate, when your bone heals, it'll prematurely heal the epiphyseal plate. Now, by the time you're 21, your epiphyseal plate's pretty much sealed, and you're not going to grow any taller for the rest of your life. So that's when, at around 18 to 21 years of age, is when you stop growing. And that's why. Because that epiphyseal plate turns to solid bone and it isn't able to divide anymore. So the shaft of a long bone is called the diaphysis, and the ends are called the epiphysis. And the epiphyseal plate separates the epiphysis from the diaphysis. So try pronouncing those words.